In this video, we'll explore some of the connecting dots around ego, identity, culture, and perhaps a couple of other things. Now, Lazaris has said that the negative ego always lies and wants to destroy us, and is our biggest enemy, has a script that may include kind of rising up to some sense of success, but ultimately wants to destroy us. That the negative ego has been created as the shame-based identity that is blamed for everything that goes wrong and that cannot succeed. So those are some of the comments and, in a general gist about the negative ego. And that we need a positive ego, an interface. So the negative ego always lies, and we need an ego. The ego is the identity, so to speak. It's the interface through which we relate to the outside world. Now, identity is the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Now, we could slice that up into 1,000 different ways, but the identity is the presenting pattern. We recognize or recognize a pattern because it's happened before, right? I have the opinion that I'm speaking because the sounds have a pattern, right? It sounds like me, or in other words, there's a me that's attaching itself to the pattern and saying, that's my pattern, meaning that's the pattern I associate with. I talk like this, I think like this, I feel like this, and I find myself, so to speak, by recognizing the pattern. That's my pattern, or that isn't me, that's an unusual pattern. Whether it's good, whether it's bad, I may have opinions about that, but that's an unusual pattern. Now, the ego is a fractal representation of the cult or culture into which we are born. The cult or culture is also a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Every culture in history has had a series of defining patterns. We eat this food. We do these types of work. We speak these languages, which are all patterns. A pattern of preparing the food, a pattern of eating the food, a pattern of when we eat the food, a pattern of using these symbols to represent these realities as opposed to these other symbols, right? They're just patterns. And when the pattern is recognizable, if you can put the pattern, if someone can witness the pattern and see it and say that's what they do, they eat curry and they eat lambus and they eat, if you can recognize the pattern, then it becomes a culture, right? If you can't recognize the pattern and you just see, millions of people doing completely random things that seem to have nothing to do with one another, well, you don't call that a culture, you call that a chaos, a mob, right? Because you can't reassemble the pattern in your mind that predicts what that group of people is likely to do. In the arrogance of Western imperialism, we've often called that savages, right? We couldn't figure out the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. So rather than, trouble ourselves to figure it out, we just labeled it as animal or savage. And even if we could see the pattern, right, we couldn't see the purpose of the pattern, right? Even if we could see that, this young man was being initiated in a tradition, we didn't see the pattern, and we didn't understand the value of an initiated adult relative to a teenager, right? So we just label that as barbarity, as absurdity, right? And then use those demeaning patterns, our words, as a basis for dishonoring the humanity in ourselves and in other human beings. So we have these frameworks, we have these patterns that we can look and say, oh, there's an American. How do you know? Well, the skin color is like this, the accent is like this, they're speaking English, they're using dollar bills. There are some corollary patterns that are used to build it up, right? And so that's the basis for the label. Now, if we understand that the ego, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being as an individual, is a fractal microcosm of the family system, which is a fractal microcosm of the cultural system or cult system. And it is informative that the root word of culture is cult, because all a cult is a series of self-referential patterns. Right? What makes something a cult is everyone in the cult does this thing, says this thing, thinks this thing, feels this thing, is this way. And it's self-referential. You say, well, why do you eat chrysanthemums for lunch? Well, because we eat chrysanthemums for lunch. And why do you do that? Well, because we did that, because that's what we do. And that's what we do because that's what we did. And that's what we did because that's what should be done. It's a self-referential pattern, as opposed to referencing intelligence or referencing data or referencing something transcendence, which is not self-referential, it's other-referential. For example, why do you put gasoline in your car? Well, I put gasoline in my car every single time because it is a car that runs on gas. And if I put diesel in, or put kerosene in, or put vegetable oil in, or put water in, it ruins the engine, and then I have to spend thousands of dollars to get a new engine. That's why I always do this. That's not a cult self-referential pattern. That's a pattern that references an external goal that references data, right? Yes, every single person who has put vegetable oil in a gas engine has not been able to drive their car as well. So that's not a cult meme. It's an intelligent meme. It's referencing the best external data that's available. But every cult, every culture has lots of things that do not add up. So if someone commits a relatively harmless crime and causes public harm, right? Why do you put them in an institution that statistically correlates with them coming out of that institution, that system of memes, more likely to produce more harm? And why do you tax the public $1 million, which is obviously a lot more harm than a candy bar or a puff of marijuana, why do you tax the public? Meaning, because the public was harmed, why do you give the public $1 million bill as a way of remedying the harm? Like, how did you come up with that one as the best of all the possible solutions? Well, you see, when that can't be answered intelligently using the best data available, that's called a cult. Well, that's the justice system. Yeah, but I thought justice was about balancing the scales, right? So you're saying this person stole a candy bar, ran out of the store with a pair of pants that cost $29. And that's terrible, obviously, because, we can't have businesses having to buy things and then lose the $15 of profit that theft represents. But you're saying that the best solution was $1 million of public money was spent to group all the criminals together in a way that statistically makes it more likely that that person will do more than steal a pair of pants when they come out. They're less friendly to the public that did that to them, number one. And the $1 million was paid by the public. And that's the best case scenario. Well, it has its ups and downs, but yeah, that's what we do. Well, have you thought of another system? No, we're busy, right? So, a cult is a series, no matter where you look. Well, you're saying that studying algebra is going to prepare this young person to run their own business, but that learning sales and marketing isn't on the agenda. You're saying that learning trigonometry is on the agenda, but minimizing spousal abuse or dealing with traumatic symptoms or discovering and healing intergenerational parental abuse didn't make the cut. And how many people in your cult are dealing with intergenerational abuse? And when's the last time you used trigonometry? And nobody's thinking about this? Sounds a bit cult-like, right? It's not referencing intelligent data, it's referencing slogans. We all need to have a good foundation of mathematics, right? Nothing wrong with mathematics, but really there's no living debate. No, it's that's the way it is because that's the way it is. And so identity is a series of habits, a series of patterns. Cults, a series of identities, a series of patterns. And the intelligence of an identity can be measured by the efficiency with which energy, time, money, and natural resources are converted into sustainable well-being. So an intelligent individual will take the time, money, and natural resources they have and will convert that energy into a life that brings about sustainable well-being for themselves and those around them. And a really, really dumb person will take an enormous amount of time, money, and natural resources and spend them to make their life worse. Right? So that at the end of all that investment in money and time and cost, that they and everyone around them will feel miserable more than they did before, right? So that would be evidence of stupidity, meaning just not getting it, right? Stupidity just means you didn't get the pattern, right? Because nobody is setting out as an end goal. Now, admittedly, right, when you're beaten up as a child, and that's the only time you get love and attention from your parents, which you desperately need, it becomes intelligent as a child to go get beaten up again, right? And so, but the end game is to feel sustainably better. That's what all of life wants in the end. And whether we achieve that or not is largely determined by our intelligence, by the capacity to recognize what is the way to do that and what is the way not to do that. If we invest our time, money, and natural resources intelligently, it has that effect. Our well-being goes up, and those around us. Human states are viral in nature. So this is the default mode, right? Every infant starts copying their parents. You know, why do Japanese kids eat sushi? Well, it's very simple. It's not a logical debate between, they didn't get handed Mexican and this and that and everything around, and they said, well, of everything that, we're eating here, we like sushi. No, right? In a cult, the dominant food is given to the child, and the food is eaten, and that's the food that I eat, right? And the language, right? Why doesn't the Japanese kid speak Korean? It's not an intellectual debate. There is a default mode where the dominant patterns in the cult or culture are given to the next generation, who accepts them without rational analysis. And so everyone, to begin with, is in some way a replica of their family system, a replica of their culture. And it isn't until adolescence when we begin to question and then either get hit back hard in an insecure cult. In an insecure cult, questions are not welcome because they're in very dogmatic cults, they fall apart by the simplest of questions. They don't make any sense. And so you got to hit questions hard. You've got to attack. You've got to build, in Christianity or something, you've got to come up with, a basis that anyone who questions the will of God is evil and should be attacked. You just questioned my will representing the will of God, so you need to be punished as a bad person and threatened with hell. I mean, you don't need to threaten someone with hell who's changing their tire by pointing out that they got it wrong, that the threads of the screw are counterclockwise, and they'll change the tire faster if they turn the wrench this way. Watch, look and see. See? Turns this way very fast. Tightening, you're kind of out of luck, right? The tire isn't going to get changed in the foreseeable future, right? But if you do it this way, minutes away from changing the tire. Intelligent memes, patterns, do not require backup. They are adopted voluntarily for the obvious reason that everyone wants to feel sustainably better. And in the case of someone trying to change their car, tire will feel better if they change it in 5 minutes rather than have to haul it off after 3 days of doing it the wrong way, right? So it's self-evident, right? The shift occurs voluntarily when it's based on data that someone can understand. But it has to be backed up. A shift towards insanity, towards stupidity, has to be backed up with all kinds of external forces if it's not actually clear that it's in the person's interest to participate. You give us all this money and we'll spend it on your behalf. Don't ask how exactly, just give us your tax money and be off, right? So these things require a little bit more effort. So there's a lot of cult-like patterns in most cults, particularly older cults, because much like laws, right, where it's illegal for women to wear pants, right? But that was written in 1875, and this, and much like laws, there's an ossification. There's a dying process where things get put in place, but then they don't get dissolved and re-examined. And so a culture gradually dies for the most part, which is why 95% of all of the 10,000 cults or cultures estimated to exist in human history are now dead, right? Nowhere to be found. They all had their story, they all had their diet, they all had their names for the deities. 95% of them are dead, and more are dying all the time, right? Languages, cult, belief systems, they're dying all the time. And when you get bound up in a routine of patterns that are not very efficient, eventually, you get so encumbered with all of these patterns that energy can't flow through that system efficiently, and the system dies. Thank goodness, right? That's evolution, right? And then a slightly more intelligent system gets born. Well, then if we as individuals, as individual egos, are fractal representations of our cult, of our family system, certainly until we examine them, and there's any number of things we're still doing, right? I'm still wearing clothes, I'm still speaking English, I'm still using the body that was handed down, a haircut somewhat within the spectrum of norms, using a video technology that was handed to me. I didn't invent it, right? So, and we're not out dancing and in a sweat lodge. We're digesting mental information consistent with the doctrines in our cult that elevate the mind and sublimate the body. You think it's comfortable sitting in this chair? Of course not. No, I'm a cult member of a cult that values verbal articulation over dance, over any number of, frankly, more fun ways of communicating. Deep eye gazing and chanting would be quite nice. It's just none of the neighbors in my cult are into it. And so we have this. So what's the larger extrapolation of a positive ego and a negative ego, and we need an ego? Well, that would be there's a positive culture and a negative ego, and we need a culture. We need a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. We need default mode assumptions. The question is why? Well, one of the reasons we need habits is we don't have the bandwidth or the presence of mind, for the most part, to evaluate every single moment of our entire life, moment by moment. This moment I'll speak Japanese, this one I'll speak English, this one I'll speak French, this one I'll be on my way there, then I'll reverse and do this. And going to resign my job and do this. No, I'm going to carry on doing that job. It's too much. So we develop core operating routines, and then we have a certain amount of variability in that. That's perhaps 10 to 20%, and we can keep up with that, right? Our conscious mind can say, as I'm doing the same job I've always done and going to work the way I've always gone to work, I'm going to get a pumpkin latte instead of a latte. Oh, my life is so interesting, right? So I'm still going to go to work. I'm still going to rely on drugs to wake me up in the morning. I'm still going to rely on milk but I'm going to add a little bit of pumpkin flavor in the latte. And that's the variation. That's what makes the day unique, right? Or I'm going to wear a red tie instead of a blue tie. And, what a unique thing. It's a red tie, And so, but these are very, very minor tweaks in a pattern. And if we look at the culture, the cult, there's a bell curve. There's a bell curve of adaptation, of innovation, where something, when it's first invented, like the polio vaccine or whatever, when it's first invented, it has a benefit, and it's very, very small, and it rises and it gets adopted, and it becomes the majority meme, meaning the majority are now getting vaccinated for polio. And and when this first happens, right, polio plummets, fear of polio plummets, everyone has hope for the future. It's pretty neat, and everyone's doing it, right? But, as things, taper off, as, new technology gets developed, as people forget about polio, as nobody's particularly bothered by it, as no one's frightened of it, the technology wears off. And ultimately, if you wait long enough, it could take a year, 10 years, 1 million years, could take 50 million years. But ultimately, the technology, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that offered well-being, that was the step forward, becomes the ossified, outdated, drag behind you weight that starts killing you. You're still doing that? Oh my goodness. That was so cute when you were 5, but you've just ruined your reputation at another party, right? Ultimately, whatever it is that we once found useful, we are killed by it. It gets in the way. It becomes an encumbrance of the new, more intelligent pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Now, Lazaris has mentioned that, no beliefs are true, so pick the ones that work. If you understand how language is constructed, you also understand that no thought is true, right? You take the one, you divide it into a grid called numbers, letters, or words, and you call this a tree, and you call this a snowy tree or a flowering tree, and you call this, air. You cut the one into bits with language, and then you ascribe words to relatively crude patterns, because we're relatively crude, right? If we say this is a hand, we can manage that. But if we start describing any of the more than billion subatomic particles in the hand, what is it? Well, it's X subatomic particle going like this, and it's too much, right? So we're happy with a hand, because a hand is simple. It's just not real, right? It's not just a hand. It's billions upon billions of vibrations in relationship, and it doesn't even exist without observing and measuring devices, and then it doesn't even exist in isolation. It's an illusionary cut. It's part of an ecology. The words are all lies. They're first of all crude, and then they create the illusion of separation that doesn't exist. This hand can be traced to the first moment of the Big Bang, and everything that pretends to separate it from everything else is ultimately an illusion. It may be useful as an illusion, but it is an illusion. It's a lie. My hand did this, my this. All of these things are crude representations of crude ideas, of imagined patterns that aren't real. So every single thing that we make up in our conscious mind is ultimately an illusion, a figment of imagination. And we construct beliefs, thoughts, ideas, and identities out of the mix of those illusions. And yet some of those illusions take us a little bit closer to sustainable well-being for a period of time, and others increase what seems like chronic and unnecessary suffering. When we persist on doing things that don't seem to make any sense, that don't correlate with anything else other than that they've always been done, and that's why we're doing them, we enter a cult-like state, and many of the patterns in our cult are destroying us, and yet they also bring us a certain relaxation, right? Anytime something new happens, a more alert, fear-based portion of the brain processes it. Anytime something is familiar, a different part of the brain processes it. It says that's what your family does. We can relax. Not really, right? You look at the statistics that say that close family members are more likely to sexually abuse their children than any other demographic. So it's kind of backwards, isn't it? If you say, well, that's your family, that's familiar, so that's safe. But the data says you're most likely to be traumatized by a family and close family member or close friend than you are by a stranger. So don't talk to strangers and spend time with your family, right? Well, does that add up? Is it okay, right? The more taboos in thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, the more cult-like the dynamic is, right? And usually the more traumatized the group is, the more frightened of the unknown the group is. The more frightened of the unknown the group is, the more taboos there are, because the unknown is bigger than the known, vastly bigger, and so you're surrounded by enemies if you're fearful of the unknown. And every traumatized person who has not addressed their trauma is terrified of the unknown, because in the unknown contains the possibility of re-exposure to the trauma that we do not know how to deal with. That threatens to break our spirit, to separate us from ourselves, to dehumanize us, and stimulate the reptilian brain and its fight, flight, freeze protocol. So if there's a negative ego, there's a negative cult. If there's a negative ego, there's a negative family. In other words, a certain percentage of the patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that we do are more destructive than they are beneficial. A certain percentage of the patterns in our family and family system are more destructive than they are helpful. And a certain amount of the patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being in the cult or culture are also more destructive than they are constructive. And that's the key, that they're more destructive than constructive relative to what? To the alternatives. Not some esoteric alternatives that might be invented someday, but the alternatives available today, right? Anyone who bleeds you with leeches is destructive, not because there are not certain instances where leeches might be better than nothing, but because they are absolutely less efficient and more toxic and painful, etc., than any number of other ways of removing blood. And so it's relative to something, relative to the other options available, right? And so what was the positive ego becomes the negative ego over time. An ego is just a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that says, that's me. And that pattern, every single thing in that pattern was once perceived as useful. Even if it wasn't useful, it was perceived as useful. Right? It was perceived as useful to the ego, to the cult, to the family, right? Even if shaming the child into secrecy was once useful, right? Because if you live in a cult that puts people to death, if you've got a woman who reads, for example, then maybe this will be our little secret. Don't tell anyone what your mother's doing, whatever. Keeps the family alive. Secrecy isn't ideal. Shame isn't ideal. Insanity isn't ideal. Lies aren't ideal, but they may be better than death in a fucked up cult that, unfortunately, the most fucked up cults are too fucked up to know that they're fucked up cults, so they're pretty fucked up, right? And so they stay. They hold on for dear life to their right to harm themselves and one another and fight off the unknown, out of traumatic terror. So you have a sense of something that was once good is now bad. Now we have family secrets and we don't tell the therapist the family secrets, so they can't do any healing work because it's a relic from the past that the family will be killed if somebody on the outside finds out what's actually going on. Right? And so there's an evolutionary pattern. There's a bell curve of innovation where something is incredibly innovative and useful and then becomes maximally useful and then becomes obsolete. But in a cult, it's not retired. So families, cults, cultures, individuals, they all have a negative ego. They all have an identity, a portion of their identity that is killing them, that is limiting the upside and increasing the downside and consuming energy. So the negative ego is trying to kill you. The identities that consume large amounts of your energy and do not provide a good yield are killing you. Whether they want to or not, they are killing you. And I think in most cases, they don't. Right? The child that embarrasses itself in order to get a laugh and get some attention is desperately in the attention deficit period of development and believing that that's the only way to get attention, is let me make a fool out of myself. And it's not trying to kill you. It's trying to survive using an outdated method that is continuing in a dissociated state because we're not integrated, because we are traumatically illiterate. by and large, families aren't trying to kill us. They're trying to maintain a status quo that some part of the system, of the body in those family members believes is necessary. That this is ultimately the way. You've got to break the child so that they won't go out and be attacked and killed, right? You've got to suppress the homosexuality so that the entire family will not be destroyed by the stupidity of the cult around it. Don't tell anyone. And you're no son of mine. And all this stuff is just an antic to maintain a survival strategy that at one time kept the family, kept the individual alive, and now is killing it, is killing off all life. And so that, that cycle is, I think, very important to bring attention to. But it also suggests that anything that could be said about the negative ego at an individual level can be said at a collective level. That, your negative culture is destroying you. And how big, what percentage of your culture is constructive and attuned to best practices, and what percent of your culture is attuned to doing things that are highly destructive just because that's the way they've always been done? Is it 50-50? Right. But most cults die rather than iterate and change into something transcendent.